Well, good morning, everybody, on this rainy morning. Um, This is week 4 of our session presented from the Smathers Library Special Collections. Um, and our speaker this morning is Carol McAuliffe, who's, you'll see on the screen, she's head of maps and imagery, uh, a huge collection at UF. And since last summer, Carol has also been the interim chair of all special collections, um, coming in to hold the fort while our friend Haven Hawley went off to Cornell to help their library program. Carol, during the time that she's been chair, the collections continue to grow at UF, and she's provided leadership and all the admin stuff that has to be done day in and day out. Today, Carol is going to be speaking on the subject of maps that lie.
Ron, thank you, Julie. Yes, I might adjust this a little bit. Hopefully it doesn't. As Ron said, my name's Carol McAuliffe. I am the head of the Map and Imagery Library. I've also been interim chair of Special and Area Studies Collections. And I'll be honest, this is sounds a very salacious, title. And I'm excited to dig into it with you all today. I've been the map librarian since about 2006. We've only been in special collections since 2013, but it's actually been a really great collaboration. It's been an amazing place for our collection to grow because maps really do have a very special quality about them. They've always been a love of mine my entire life, so I feel pretty lucky to be the map librarian, and I'm really excited to share some of these maps with you today. So why do maps lie? Well, they're evil, of course. And, they're out to trick us, and everything you know is wrong. um, Obviously, this is tongue-in-cheek, but I did kind of feel that way when I'm thinking about maps and information and the idea that, we do have to think critically about these pieces of information, just like we would anything else that we ingest to understand our world. So some of the reasons maps do lie. As Mark Monier, I'm probably mangling his name, he wrote a book that has been used in classes over and over again called How to Lie with Maps. And it does encourage students to critically think about that maps as that information resource and the idea that there are messages within these maps. And there's a lot of interpretation that goes into creating maps. And as he said, most decent maps are a collection of little lies. And, we start right from the beginning, taking a sphere and flattening it on a piece of paper. And that 3D, trying to get that 3D shape onto a flat piece of paper causes right from the start that they are going to be inaccurate. They are not going to be a perfect representation of that sphere. Also, as power dynamics come into play, governments have their own agendas, people have their own biases and ideas of what they would like to portray in the maps. They might be intentionally manipulating people, and we'll see some examples of that. I don't go too much into the economics of it, but you will see it a little bit towards the end. And copyright protection, I got too many examples, so I wasn't able to get into that too much, but I'll tell you right now, there's this thing called paper map or paper towns, and that is an example of map makers like Rand McNally or Gusha. People or companies who wanted to protect their information would put fake towns on maps. And that way they would be able to tell if a map had been um, copied. And so it was a form of copyright protection where they've actually put fantasy places. And then finally, human or mechanical error, which is obviously something we deal with all the time, both in our current society and our modern society, as well as throughout human history. When we see something on a piece of paper or in a map or in a book that, information is not linear. We don't always, you know, immediately build upon the information that is coming through the world. And similarly, information hasn't always been available to everyone. So we'll see some of those examples as well. All right, this is one that I might have to go over here to read. Is it microphone? All right, sorry. All right. So this was I think, a really pertinent quote to what we're going to be looking at. All maps strive to frame their messages in the context of an audience. All maps state an argument about the world, and they are propositional in nature. All maps employ the common devices of rhetoric, such as invocations of authority and appeals to a potential readership through the use of colors, decoration, topography, dedications, and written justifications of their method. Rhetoric may be concealed, but it is always present, for there is no description without performance. All right. So since you all couldn't be at the Map and Imagery Library today, I also wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of where I've come from. This is on the first floor of Smathers Library, the Map and Imagery Library. As Ron said, we have a huge collection, over 1 million items. It includes antique maps, geospatial data sets, aerial photography, satellite imagery, and we host numbers of classes. In fact, this week I'm teaching 4 classes. And this is the 5th. So I appreciate being here, and I hope you all can come visit as well. All right, so we're gonna start with an old classic, and this is the Mercator projection. The Mercator projection, as you are probably well aware, was one of the standard projections that was used in our schoolrooms. For a long time, it was on the side, on a wall in the Rights Union. And the Mercator projection has taken a lot of criticism for kind of how it portrays that round sphere onto a flat plane. And the main reason that Mercator created this and this projection is so that, let's see if this pointer, let's see. Might not be the right, okay. So when crossing the Atlantic, they were mostly interested in trying to conserve or keep accurate the distance between longitudinal lines. And so these longitudinal, latitudinal squares, they wanted them to have perpendicular points. But to do that, that ends up distorting the polar regions. And you have the unfortunate, or the idea that Greenland then becomes almost the size of Africa. We'll see in another example how distorted that is. Now, is this map lying? As we say, all maps are lying to an extent. It is important, though, especially for students, to think about how is this impacting their view of the world. This, of course, is an antique map from 1783, so they might look at it a little less seriously, but they see a modern map in the Mercator projection, and it is impactful as far as, how much space are we actually taking up on this planet? This is another example of projection. This is the Peters World Map, and in this projection, the map makers were wanting to conserve the amount of space that each landmass is taking up on the Earth. And that means they wanted to accurately show how big Africa was, how, and how other countries kind of are their size in relation to each other. And this one, Greenland is way up here. And you can see how big of a difference that is from the Mercator projection. Neither of these maps are wrong. They both, though, do have to distort our world to some extent. And how you distort it will depend on what you're wanting to use this map for. And this is another version of our world, and we are spinning through space. This is, and there's no up, down, north, south. I mean, as far as like what is going to be at the top of the map was not predetermined. And it, we have standardized north being at top. There's some arguments. The reason that is because, a lot of Western society was, a dominating society for a lot of Western cultural development. And because of that, we have the north at the top where majority of our land masses are. But this map is from Australia and they want it to be on top. And honestly, this isn't, and it's really, I think, important to think about if we, I'm gonna try to see if I can point out Florida. If we saw ourselves here and the rest of the world around us like that, like how does the place that we see ourselves on the map change how we see ourselves? And I know I did a little bit of a sense of vertigo just because it does sense, kind of change that impression in my head. And I wanted the idea that north is at the top is not, has not been standard for very long. I would say that there are numerous examples in our antique maps where they do not have north at the top, some very large maps. The early maps in the 12th century and before, they were called TO maps. And those maps often organized the world with Asia at top. We have Europe and Africa. And sometimes they even would put Jerusalem right in the center. And they would organize the world around that. Similarly, if you look at maps of ancient China, again, they have China at the top, everyone in the West is below them. And there's that implicit hierarchy that comes into play when you're looking at these maps. This is an example of Brazil from 1670 to 1673. And this is oriented with the West at the bottom and East at the top. So it definitely changes even your viewpoint of Brazil when you look at it like this. This is another example. This is showing Florida, actually. This is Florida, and this is Cuba. And I imagine that this was used for maritime reasons. They have a lot of the rhombus lines listed here. They also have some insets of some of the major cities. But again, this was not immediately recognizable to us in this format, but it was perfectly acceptable and something that you might see very commonly. Here's another example of a kind of map that is, again, is it lying? It's not, it is intentionally distorting and kind of creating an information source that is allowing for a particular use. And in this case, Pudinger's table was an example of an early Roman road map. And it was actually first found in a number of scrolls back in 1494. And they were, the monks at the time had copied those scrolls, and thankfully they did, because then they were able to then get this version from 1652, which is basically a facsimile, but it is showing a large, long, let me show you here, map. If you put each one of those little segments together, it forms this one long, really road map where it's really just an itinerary, stop 1, stop 2, and you can find your way to Rome. And you can see all these, I might have even, nope, I did not. All these roads here that go to Rome. And the actual map that it's covering, the area is here, which each of those little segments has kind of been squished and distorted until to keep it on this scroll. So again, in that way, similarly to putting a 3D sphere on a flat map, in this situation, you have, sorry, I get away from the microphone. In this situation, you wanted to have a scroll. Like, how do you get a very large road map on a scroll? Well, you squish it and you stretch it and you make it look a little odd. You can kind of see the boot here. This is of Italy, where you can kind of tell this is kind of how stretched and oddly oriented it is. All right, and now we're going to move on to Africa. I have a lot to say about Africa, in part because we in our Western society and our map collection does have mostly maps that were created by Western culture. And a lot of those have a variety of views about Africa. And it's important to remember this is an imagining often of Africa. They didn't have a lot of information, or sometimes they had particular information and they were trying to push a particular agenda. There's some of those things on this map that I wanted to point out when I was talking about the peoples of Africa, or like what is happening in Africa. I mean, they obviously had some other views of who was there, and they put a cyclops type creature called the monokuli here in Africa. But I think I don't go into it in a lot of detail on the other maps, but I think it is always important to think about that representation and how people are represented on these maps. Another interesting thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but the way the mountain ranges are displayed, there's a particular reason for this, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But these are just, they didn't really know exactly where. It was just an approximation of where the mountain ranges were. These two lakes being the source of the Nile and the mountains of the moon, coming from the mountains of the moon, is another interesting element that we'll explore a little further. That is incorrect, I will say. The source of the Nile is not two lakes, but you see it for a couple of 100 years in maps following the discovery. And when you're talking about mechanical error, I wanted to point this map out too, because this map is from 1569. We were not actually sure which edition of this map that we had until we noticed this. And instead of Hispania, it just says Pania. And the reason it says Pania is that the His part fell out when they were trying to create this woodcut. And so we were able to identify which version of this map we had based on the missing His. But again, we don't always know. You might think, well, they must have called it Pania at that time. That's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of investigation that has to go into this to understand what's actually happening on these maps. So the reason those mountains are listed like that, and the reason that we think the source of the Nile is two lakes, and the fount of most of the geographic information that we had in the Middle Ages came from the discovery of Claudius Ptolemy's Geographia and Cosmographia, which were kept in Muslim libraries for about 1,300 years. They were discovered again at the start of the Renaissance, and they were translated from Arabic into Latin. They did not have any of their original maps with them. So all they had, because Ptolemy was one of the first people to create a projection in a latitude and longitude and some coordinates, they had these um, relative positions. And so they would know, okay, there's a mountain range that goes from this point to that point, and they would draw it. And there's a city in this place, so they would put it. Um, and this information at this point is very old, but this was the beginning of like modern geographic knowledge and understanding our world, and again, how we see ourselves in this world. This is another map. This is one of my favorite maps. I'll talk a little bit more about it. So you'll see, again, they're using this, there it is, the mountain ranges. Some of the things I love about this map is, we have North America here as listed as Terra de Cuba. And Cuba is actually listed, you can't really see it here, but as Isabella. This is actually Japan, which is listed as Zirapingu, which is an old name for Japan. And you'll see plenty of monsters, some sea creatures and things like that. And again, going back to the idea of how are they representing other peoples and other lands, they have cannibals here as well. Maps that lie. Why did they put all these things on here? They had a lot of uncertainty about our world, and so they filled it with things like dragons and sea monsters. One of the other interesting things about this map is it was considered quite heretical at the time, because the idea that the world was round and turning on an axis was not widely accepted. And this map had two cherubs turning the world on a crank. So in this situation, that was actually, there was some accuracy there, understanding that. But at the time, they didn't always accept that or understand that. Yeah, it's just a little sliver. So, but as I mentioned, I want to talk more about these two lakes, and you'll see them. Go back here just so you can see where this came from, this map right here in Africa. And again, the two lakes. And once you start seeing these two lakes, every time you look at an antique map of Africa, they'll start popping out. You'll see them more. For instance, this is just really a few years later, and you will see a big difference in maps as they go from woodcut to copper plate. So much more definition and detail is available to them. But again, two lakes of Africa, the source of the Nile. We saw earlier how large Africa really is. You can get 5 of the United States into Africa. And most of this area hadn't actually been explored at this point, but they were going on descriptions, on Ptolemy's description about what was happening in this interior part of the continent. This is another beautiful map. This is a Mercator map. And he, again, has these two lakes, as well as interesting projection. This is not a Mercator projection map, even though it is by Mercator. And this one's from 1633. So this one's about 50 years after the Ortelius one. And we're still seeing those two lakes. Also 1688, DeWitt, another version with those two lakes here. They look very official. You would see this and you would think, we still have students sometimes who you'll think, well, there must have been these two lakes, because why would they have put them there with so much detail and information? They were putting what they thought was correct. And there's a lot more that could be said about these cartouches, but we'll have to save that for another talk. Maybe y'all have me back. All right, so then we start getting into late 1600s, really into the early 1700s. And they start to recognize, wait, maybe we don't actually know what is here. And this map maker, Corneli, who is ironically famous for one of the most interesting maps of the United States with Canada, or not Canada, sorry, California as an island is one of his maps, talking about maps that lie. But in this case, he was recognizing that, oh wait, these two lakes, we don't know what's going on here. Instead he created this interesting kind of inset part of the map. And is it not gonna come up? All right, maybe I accidentally put it as, so this is the blow up of that inset. And I love, I translated it as best as I could. Here, I did look up some words to see if I can figure this out. But he talks about, this is what I'm going to try to read. The flooding river Nile was called Abai by the Abyssinians, that is, father of the waters. King Sosostris, Ptolemy, Philadelphus of Egypt, Cambyses of Persia, and Alexander the Great all tried to trace its unknown source repeatedly without it coming to light. Ancient and many modern geographers believed it to be born from the mountains of the moon. And that's where those two lakes were kind of coming out of the mountains of the moon. The Portuguese then reported the glorious important news, which served us for their regulation of Abyssinia. I think they meant like understanding its boundaries and what is happening in that space, based on the accredited reports of Father Balazar Tellez and of Ludolfo. Now, they don't actually tell us what they discovered, which I thought was interesting. It was more of an acknowledgement that we don't really know, but more news is coming. And when I was researching this a little more, I noticed, or I read some reports of people saying that they felt like Corneli, who was a globe maker, was particularly saying like, saying like disrespecting the maps. This map is about to fall into the Nile. Somebody's sitting on a globe. It was kind of a rejection of that old cartographic knowledge that they had been espousing for so many years. Even with that, early in, like that was, I think 1690, 20 years, even 30 years later, you would still often see maps that had these two lakes. This one, I don't have but it talks about it being a representation of the changing regions and status of Africa, as well as the origin of the Nile. So he actually does even specifically mention the origin of the Nile, almost in a way of like putting in his face, like, no, I'm going to keep this on my map. But as we get into the late 1700s and the 1800s, suddenly they just take it all off the map. Like, we're just going to have blank space instead, which is a whole nother way of completely giving a wrong information about what is there. And there are lots of maps in this time period that don't really have anything in this kind of region of Africa where they weren't really sure exactly what was going on. This is a more modern representation, just so we could see in comparison what was happening. And it's kind of understandable how they were maybe a little confused. It is hard to see how it was all connected. Plus, again, Africa is huge. So, this alone is probably about the size of the United States. So the idea that they didn't really know what was going on was understandable, but how they represent it on that map does make a difference to the people who were utilizing those materials. Let me take a quick drink. Also with Africa, we have the legend of Prester John. Now, Prester John was supposedly a Christian king who in the Dark Ages, there was reports that he was in Asia, there were reports that he was in Africa, and it was one of the things that was used to kind of encourage the Crusades, encourage people in going into, Christians especially, going into these regions to save this Christian king. And you see him pop up on maps too. And this is a element of of propaganda or trying to push a certain view. There has never been any evidence found of Prester John in these regions, but here Ortelius talks about a Christian king and how the religion of of this area was Christianity, but that because of I think he said pestilence, that the people had gone to what they called a smaller religion. And in this one, Langren also talks about Prester John and has, let me see, I think, yeah, has a little kind of inset to kind of show his Prester John in his glory, and it says like the king is ready, let's go. And I think again they're trying to portray this idea of let's go and rescue this Christian king. Other legends that are on our maps. This one, again, you start seeing these two lakes everywhere, so just keep an eye out for them. In this map from 1699, it's showing a little bit of the New World and South America. And here you can see El Dorado. Again, El Dorado, the mythical city. Was it actually here? There was a lot of reports around this time that there was this city of gold near Paramay Lake. And this is the equator, this red line. So people would come and they would look for El Dorado near this lake, near the equator. As far as I know, I don't think they were ever definitively found what they thought they were going to find. There were certainly other things there. But you'll see these also pop up on these old maps, these remnants of information, these kind of ideas to explore, not always accurate. Speaking of not always accurate, this is a view of St. Augustine. So you can notice the Castillo de San Marcos here. This is the entrance to St. Augustine, and this was done by the Dutch. And you can actually see some evidence of Dutch ships and Dutch architecture kind of around, but there are not mountains in Florida. I think we all know this. We've been here long enough. And, there's so many ideas of why they might have done this. And my personal favorite is the idea that, they knew what they were familiar with and what the people they were going to be showing these maps were familiar with. And a lot of times they would use things that were similar to their environment and kind of show it on these strange, unusual lands to kind of bring a little bit of familiarity to it. Same reason they might use Dutch architecture, Dutch ships in the harbor, especially if they were trying to encourage people to go into these areas. You might not be as familiar with Cuba, but this is showing Matanzas Bay. And when we first purchased this map and I showed it to a well-known Cuban researcher, Lily Guerra, she laughed so hard. And she's like, this is not what it looks like. There's these like surrounded by mountains, almost volcanic mountains with how pointy and they are. It is a pretty flat region in that section. And again, this is a Dutch map, so I'm wondering if they were, both of these are kind of similar in that way. But again, it's a really important point to think about how are these maps affecting the way people are seeing that region. All right, this is one of my favorite examples. We just recently purchased this map, and it is a fairly rare map. I think only 3 institutions that have it. And it says it is a map of Cuba, and it was trying to show the Sir Francis Drake invasion of Cuba. But if you know anything about the shape of Cuba, which we just saw here, this doesn't look a whole lot like it. Now, antique maps, things can be a little squishy there. You know, we don't always get the right shapes. We've shown many examples, even into modern day, where shapes can be distorted. But an interesting element of this map, when people were first trying to say, well, this doesn't look quite right, they found this map, and this is of Cartagena. This is by Baezo about 10 or 15 years earlier. And this is showing the maps and views illustrating Sir Francis Drake West Indian voyage as well. And you can see, looking at these maps side by side, that they are almost an exact copy. I cut it off, but even the little lizard, the iguana, was exactly the same. This was an unknown map maker. We're not exactly sure who did it, but they took the same plate and they just said it was Cuba. Not only that, they also labeled it around the corner as if it was, Cuba with Peru and New España, which would be around Mexico, Florida, and then what did that say? I can't read it here, but that's basically Louisiana. But they've gotten this kind of switched around as well. But yeah, they've tried to provide some spatial context, but it is all wrong. So then the question becomes, is this a map of Cuba? It's been labeled as such, but as far as our historical context, it's really, there's nothing at all accurate about this being Cuba, except for, that they have some words that represent Cuba on it. But for looking at our historical paper trail, it's still a very, very important map. It's one of those very distinct places where you're like, yes, this map is lying. All right, so why do maps lie? Well, they shape our view of the world. People are trying to give us messages. They want us to understand how they see the world. They want us to, also sometimes they want us to go off and find the Prester John, or understand the implications of the resources of an area. They give life to myths and legends, and honestly, they can't help it. They're not evil. They're not, their maps are an approximation. They're colored by our beliefs, our desires, and our biases, and it's really important to look at all of these with that critical eye. So thank you all very much. This has been a topic that I've been interested in for a long time, and this was the first time I've gotten to present on it, so thank you for my guinea pigs today as I talk to you all about maps. And feel free to ask me any questions about this or tell me stories about your favorite maps. I'll be at lunch with you today too.
Yeah. Thank you, Carol. Questions?
What was the methodology used by a math maker 500 years ago to create something like the shape of Africa?
That's a really good question because it's actually quite. Do you mind putting it up? Yeah, I won't bring it back to a map of Africa. I mean, this one works. 1699. They don't have satellite imagery. They don't have, aerial photography. They've never seen the entirety of Africa. How do they get it so close? it goes for a couple of different things. One is they did start to use triangulation along the coastal lines, and sometimes you'll see that maps are just coastlines with, in part because that's really the areas that they really did do the most, they had the most access to, and they did the, I don't know, I wish I could tell you the exact way and like have diagrams about how they do it, but that was a fairly accurate way that they were able to get some of these coastlines. Now, I didn't include that many maps of Florida, but it's interesting to look at, let's see, actually, did I have any that, I feel like there was one, but, oh, I know which one. Okay, this one. So this is a lot less accurate looking. But I'll tell you, especially as you get into more of the details, it's a lot easier to see where they got things wrong. So I'm sure with they got a pretty general shape. They knew based on triangulation and sailing around in those regions. But when it came to Florida, for instance, there was descriptions, sometimes written on the maps where it called it a net of lakes and broken lands because it was so wet and so much, like think about the Everglades, like where does the Gulf of Mexico and the Everglades start? If it's kind of a mishmash. And so you can see, and you include the keys in there as well. So as they're trying to make these decisions and how to represent it, a lot of times you'll see that tip of Florida kind of cut off or off to the side. And that is in part because of the both shifting nature of the coastline of Florida and also the kind of ambiguity that exists within our landscape. I mean, I could have a whole nother presentation on antique maps of Florida and how they've represented our state over time.
Carol, would you say that in those early maps, they were relying very heavily on mariners, the results of explorers, and that's why probably why the coastline tends to be pretty well defined.
Yes, for sure. And interior it was usually a lot of that was relying on descriptions from explorers. One of the things that sometimes you'll see in maps of Africa, you'll just have lines and you'll have like place names along those lines, but similar to the other maps from the late 1700s, 1800s, they're blank everywhere else or like nearby. And you might think, well, there's just this road and those are the cities that are next to it, but there's nothing out into the other areas. That's not true. They just hadn't explored. They just would take, one person would travel from point A to point B and they would map what they saw, but everything around it was still a mystery. So they left it blank. So it's important to understand what you're looking at there.
We have a question on Zoom. John Reiskin, go ahead.
Yeah, obviously Prince Henry, I think that's his name, the navigator of Portugal. The Portuguese seem to make the major contribution to those African maps, perhaps. But I had a question about your collection. Do you have a collection of globes? And when was the first globe of the Earth produced? A global map, I mean. But do you have globes there in your collection?
Oh, yes. Let me go back to that question. We do have globes. We don't have any antique globes, though. We have some facsimile globes, or most of ours are mid-modern, like from the 1940s to present day, our collection of globes. Though we do have a couple of globes of, Mars and Venus and the moon, which is a whole nother thing, but, that's a different kind of collection than we're talking about right now. And as far as the first globe, so when you're looking at those old, kind of depends how you define the world. So some of the earliest representations of the entirety of the known world were in those TO maps that I showed with, that kind of just was like a simple graphic where, you know, Asia's at top, then you have Europe and Africa, and often Jerusalem in the middle. And that was kind of the first representation of the known world that I'm aware of. It was not on a globe, though. I don't know what the first globe would have been.
The other thing I remember as a child is that the British Empire was always, they always used the color red for it on maps, and you could see all the possessions of the British Empire on maps. I thought that was an interesting way, and boy, did they have an empire.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, I mean, talking not about lying, but showing dominance in the world using colors on
Yes.
on maps. I wonder if there's any other. I think most French were either, I think they were green or blue on the maps, where the colors have an impact. The use of colors in maps.
Yes. So color is a whole chapter in that book called How Maps Lie, or How to Lie with Maps. And the use of the color red is always fascinating because it is used to call attention to things. And if you use it incorrectly, then or if you're not thinking and you're like, oh, I'll just make this red. No, don't do that unless you really want to call attention to it. Similarly, don't use the color blue unless you are trying to represent water, because it seems that even when we're like, well, we can probably use a different shade. It just reads like blue or water. Sorry. It's very hard to kind of separate our societal kind of conventions around color from the maps. And it's important as a map maker to be aware of that, because it does impact the message. And again, that message is a form of rhetoric, you know, and it's maybe it's not an outright lie, but at the same time, you know that people in those regions aren't going to necessarily agree with the map that the British Empire is putting out. So it's not also the entirety of the truth.
And that map of Florida seemed to show Yucatan at the bottom right of that. So they had that right too.
Yeah.
You know. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question concerning the use of Prester John. And I don't know what a prester is. I mean, was that like a priest? Or just tell me more about these words that I don't understand, like prester and so forth, that are added.
I would have to do a little more research because I'm a little afraid of saying it wrong. But my understanding was that he was a Christian, that he was put out there as a Christian king. So I don't know if prester was, I mean, it does kind of sound like priest. I know he was very much within the Christian conversation at that time. So it's possible that that has some impact, but I honestly don't know of the term prester, if it was to indicate some kind of title of some sort or if it was part of his name. But I believe the letters around the, let's say 10th century was when I first start seeing some kind of letters from him. But at first they're talking about him being in Asia. And then I think as interests, this is my own kind of maybe cynical thoughts on this, but as interest moved away from Asia into Africa by the, you know, the 1600s, when this legend is still out there that there was a Christian kingdom that they need to go and save, they're like, hey, let's put it in Africa. Like they had a lot of interest in Africa and they wanted to kind of infiltrate it and they wanted people to be with them as they went into Africa. So that is my understanding of that legend, though there is a lot more to dig in there and dig into there. some on our maps and elsewhere in our rare books and other collections. So maybe an exhibit coming at
I
some
think
point.
we have one on Zoom.
Yep, Phyllis, go ahead if you'd like to unmute.
According to Google, presture is a French word for meaning provide, to provide. It's a verb. So to provide John, well, perhaps to provide a John of the well, I'm pretty ignorant about the Christian Bible, so I don't know. He's one of the disciples, John, Luke,
That's true.
etc. So Prester John means to provide the teachings of the Bible, perhaps? Is that the implication?
That's possible. I'm not sure. It'd also be interesting to look at some of the names that he has been given in those older maps, because, you know, Prester John is a bit of a Anglicization, and I'm not going to pronounce that right, but Anglicization of the Latin that they were using for Johannes and Presbytery. I mean, they had a lot of other words that we're using at that time to describe him. So that might also give us some more clues. And yeah. Sorry. Sorry for the sound effects. All right. Because like this is how they were kind of writing his name at that time. And all of this Latin throughout there isn't like a definitive, they're not translated in the same way that text has been. It's one of those things that we have actually talked to our classics department about coming in and maybe having students, you know, help us translate some of these things, because there's a lot of text on these maps, and it'd be really interesting to see what they were trying to say throughout all of this.
You did have that one map where they showed the individual standing on the globe, coming back to John Reisman's question about the globe. I don't know what the date is there.
This one was 1690. It's a bit later. I know they had earlier globes than that. If I had to guess, I would probably put the earlier, well, so when I talked about turning on an axis, that map was kind of it's a very early map. It's not the earliest, but this is 1536. And the idea that it's turning on an axis kind of starts lending itself to being a globe at some point. But I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The first globe, I looked it up on Wikipedia. First globe was produced in 1492, called an Erdapfel. I think that means earth apple. It was about 20 inches across, and by the German navigator Martin Beheim, who was a geographer in the employee of King Juan II of Portugal. So so look it up on Wikipedia, Erdapfel. Fascinating, but this was great talk. Thank you.
One more. I have concern about map makers are in the habit of making money with maps. And so therefore there's a desire for the map makers to always be relevant to the current explorers and additions, and they will add stuff to their map because it's novel and new, but maybe not true.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of, the map makers seem to be given a latitude of narrative
They
that
absolutely
can explore because it affects their personal and professional life.
Mhm.
that they put something there. And it's kind of like when they separated California into two parts, that map is very valuable now because it's total error. But I'm just liking you to give a comment about professionalism of map makers.
Mhm. Well, there's a couple things. One, when I mentioned that information is not linear, it's partially because there wasn't like an overseeing authority over this. You know, like you said, they did have a lot of latitude. Um, they were sharing plates. I mean, as evidenced, or sometimes on purpose, sometimes not on purpose, or not with the knowledge of another map maker. And they would steal each other's plates sometimes. One interesting story that I had that I wasn't able to find a clear example of, so I didn't use it, but Sanson was a French cartographer, and he and another cartographer was sharing plates, and like one would do the geography work and one would do the engraving work. But as you know, they were concerned about other people stealing their plates or stealing their work, they would put erroneous things on their map specifically with the knowledge that it was wrong so that they would be able to catch it if somebody else stole it. And so it was very much proprietary information. It was very much personal as far as to what their own beliefs were and what their country of origin was, made a huge difference, as you could tell by the mountains on some of these. What ships might show up on these maps, all of these come into play because of the map makers and their decisions. They really are works of art, and they really are lenses into the culture and society of the time. And
Um, First of all, that would be fantastic if you could come back and talk about, for example, the maps of Florida and all the history there.
Okay.
The two quick ones, wondering the part about the moon being the source of the Nile.
Mhm.
I'm assuming they presented that metaphorically, but maybe not, maybe. And then the other one is simply the source of the Nile. Have they found that those two lakes are simply a bulbous part of the rivers that lead, the rivulets that lead up to the Nile? Where does the Nile actually begin?
All right, back to, yes, I would love to come back to talk about Florida. There was a question in the middle there.
Yeah, about the moon.
The moon, the mountains of the moon.
Being the
Okay.
source of the Nile. Wow.
They aren't, it wasn't the moon exactly. Ptolemy had listed it as the mountains of the moon. And you'll see them, let's see if any of them, don't know if I have it to correctly, you know, these mountains, they don't list them, but this does say Origio Nile. So they like the origin of the Nile. Some of the maps, and I don't think I have it blown up enough, but you'll see like Mountainous Lunas. That's just the name of that region. I don't know the origin of that name or where it came, how it came associated with the moon. It sounds very romantic, though, in a way. Now, the actual source is not, it's, so here you can see there's a lot of different lakes and regions that kind of come into and feed the different Niles, the Blue Nile, White Nile, all the way up to the formation of the Nile proper up at the top. But all of these kind of the mountains, the regions, they kind of all feed into it, as you can kind of see here. But like there weren't, I think we're probably looking at Lake Tanganyika and Lake Victoria, but they aren't connected to the Nile, or not entirely. But as one of the things that why they were particularly interested in the source of the Nile is because there was this flooding that would happen, and you know, and the Nile did feed that. And I mean, think of again, we're talking about the size of Africa. That was one of the reasons I wanted to show those projections at the beginning too, so that you could really see how big. Go back. Sorry if I make you dizzy looking through these real fast. Here, you can see, like, here we are, United States. This is Africa. You know, this whole section of the earth that we really didn't have a lot of information about, and we're still trying to discover more about. So, not sure what's a real clear answer. I don't know if there's a definitive, like, I think the Nile was so big, it had so many different water sources, but it was definitely not those two lakes and the way it was connected. That was not correct.
Well, one thing I think it does tell us is the importance of the Nile in the minds of people at that time, because it really was kind of the cradle of civilization, right?
Oh yeah, yes, absolutely. And here you see here, they have the mountains of the moon really clearly delineated
Yeah.
as well.
So they all wanted to know. They all wanted to know anyway. Yes, one more.
I had a friend whose son was working on road maps in the area of Colorado, and this is talking modern stuff.
Mhm.
And what he did was put in the map a location called Shippey's Ranch. Well, Shippey was his last name, and it was put in there so that if people copied the map, they would copy this false location and could be immediately determined.
Yes, thank you for that example, because it absolutely happened a lot. Back, like I said, Sanson did it back in the 1600s, 1700s, and people are still doing it today. Oh, what, I wanted to make another comment too about that new and accurate statement. You'll see that on maps, hundreds and hundreds of years. Everything, even today, we come up the new modern atlas, and you're like, this modern atlas is from 1940, and it's like, but over and over again, they use those words, and you're just like, no, it's not.
Yeah,
It's only going to be new for about, a couple years.
You could just imagine back in those days, when a new map maker presents the map, you want to say, buy mine because you've never seen this before, right?
Yep. This is the brand new one.
Yeah, this is the.
Yeah, one more comment, thinking about more modern maps and road maps, is they would obfuscate like the date of the map. If you go and look at Rand McNally or Gusha or some of those other gas station maps that you would get, you cannot find a date on that. And they did that on purpose because they didn't want people to know how old or new it was. They were like, no, this is okay. This is enough. But there is a code, and if you have the code, you can look it up using a system to see what the date was, but it's not easy, and they did that on purpose.
Well, this was wonderful, Carol. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Now, next week, we won't have a presentation on Thursday morning
Yes, sorry.
because Carol is calling all of her people to be hands on deck for an open house. You want to tell us a little about what that's going to be?
It's not going to be an open house exactly, but we are having I think Board of Trustees from the Florida House, which is the Washington, D.C. house that was created by Rhea Childs to welcome visitors from Florida up to Washington, D.C., have them a place to stay. And so their Board of Trustees group of 60 people is coming to see our special collections. The Dean, Judy, is going to be giving them a little talk, and we're going to be showcasing a lot of our materials for them, especially on the formation of the Florida House, which our Florida History and Political Papers has quite a great collection of that. So it's going to be really exciting. I've been wearing a lot of different hats. I've been kind of, you probably have met Ramona. When she left at the end of this last year to go to University of Alabama, I've been running a lot of the Baldwin stuff too. I am not a children's lit person, but I'm learning. I'm a curious person, so I get to learn about all these different things, and it's been a wonderful opportunity for me.
Good. And then the following week, and our last lecture for this semester, our friend Jim Cusick, who many of you remember, one of our favorite lecturers, a historian, is going to come and talk to us about what detective work was like in colonial times in St. Augustine, when they didn't have DNA and they didn't have blood types and fingerprints and all that. And knowing Jim, that'll be a fun time. So please be here. Thanks.
Sure it will be.
Thank you again, Carol.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.